This year's LOWY Institute poll was conducted in February and March. It was conducted among 1,100 Australians across all Australian states and territories, across all age groups from 18 years up, and equal numbers of men and women. The poll was conducted by both mobile phone and landline phone. It took about 20 minutes. We've worked very, very hard on the methodology of our polling over time, and we estimate that the margin for error in any of these figures is around about 2 to 3%. What I'm going to do now is just take you through some of the headline results, some of which were featured in the introductory video. This is what we found in this year's LOWY Institute poll. On migration, of course, amidst the controversy over the Roy Hill mine, we of course asked this question before that controversy came out, and we found that of course 62% of people were in favour of temporary migration to fill labour shortages. What's interesting for me about this poll is that this particular result is that 25% are strongly in favour of temporary migration, 26% are strongly against, which seems to show some bifurcation in views. We asked further questions about migration. This is the first year we've asked these questions. We asked people what criteria they thought were important for the government deciding who comes to settle in Australia. And we got as the most important criteria quite a strong result for work skills, English language skills, having similar values to Australians and education, and quite a heavy drop-off when we came to religion and race. Climate change and the carbon tax. Of course, legislation since our last poll has been passed, legislating a $23 per tonne price for carbon that will be instituted from the 1st of July this year. We asked Australians whether they supported or opposed that, and you can see the results are 63% are against that particular piece of legislation, 45% strongly against. Climate change, of course, is one of the questions we've been tracking over time. We've been tracking it since 2006, and we've seen a remarkable change. We've seen from 2/3 of Australians who supported aggressive action against climate change in 2006, that fall to just over 1/3 this year. We've also seen a remarkable rise from 24 to 45% of people who think that climate change is a problem, but it's not a pressing problem, and that we should act progressively against it and not incur too much cost. We also asked a new question about whether what people credited with Australia's avoidance of recession during the global financial crisis. We gave them two options. One was demand for Australian resources from countries like China. The other was because of good Australian government policies. And as you can see, 70% to 41% agreed with the first option. Perhaps one of the most surprising results was, again, when we asked for the first time whether they supported foreign investment in Australian agricultural land, and a very strong 81% against, including 63% strongly against. Chinese investment, keeping in mind 70% of Australians thought that our relationship with China had kept us out of recession during the global financial crisis. We see that there is still significant opposition. 56% this year thought the Australian government is allowing in too much Chinese investment. And we asked, well, among those who object to it, why do you object to Chinese investment? You probably can't read that, my apologies for that, but the two highest were China is seeking to buy Australian mining and agricultural companies, and these need to be kept in Australian hands. And China has so much money to invest it could end up buying and controlling a lot of Australian companies. Again, between last year's poll and this year's poll, the government has announced that 2,500 US Marines will be rotated through the military base in Darwin. We asked whether people are in favour or opposed, and we found strongly that people are in favour. We also asked whether people supported more US Marines, more US soldiers being based in Australia, and we found, again, quite a strong result in favour. And finally, we asked whether people would still be in favour if China or Indonesia objected to that, and we actually found that the figures increased if China or Indonesia objected to it. That's a very brief summary of some of the results that we have come up with. Sorry, there's a couple more here. War in Afghanistan continues to grow more unpopular. A decade on from the Bali bombings, I would say an ambivalence about whether the bombers have been brought to justice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite the members of our panel who will be discussing with me our poll today. Our first panellist is Rowan Callick. Rowan, of course, is the Australian's Asia-Pacific editor and was the newspaper's Beijing-based China correspondent for 3 years until returning to Melbourne at the start of 2009. Previously, he worked for the Australian Financial Review and was a senior writer with Time magazine. He has won the Graham Perkin Award for Journalist of the Year in 1995 and 2 Walkley Awards for Asia-Pacific coverage in 1997 and 2007. Our second panellist today is Meg McDonald. Meg was appointed the CEO of Low Carbon Australia, formerly the Australian Carbon Trust, in February 2010. Prior to this, she was president of Alcoa Foundation and a director, Global Issues, of Alcoa Inc. in New York. Before joining Alcoa, she was a senior Australian diplomat. She was Australia's ambassador for the environment and deputy chief of mission for Australia in Washington, DC. Our third panellist is Innes Willocks. He is the Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group. Innes joined the AI Group as Director International and Government Relations in 2008. Prior to joining AI Group, he held a number of senior roles in both the public and private sectors, including serving as Australian Consul General to Los Angeles, Chief of Staff to the Foreign Affairs Minister and Manager of Global Public Affairs for Singapore Airlines, based in Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our 3 panellists. Well, welcome to the LOWY Institute. Thanks for coming along. I might just start with some migration figures. Innes, you've been looking at this issue quite closely. Were you surprised by that level of support for temporary skilled migration?
In a little way I was. It was surprising coming with the debate we've just had, and you were very prescient in asking that question. But I think what underlined that response with, I think, 62% in favour of the importation or the use of skilled migrants to work in our workforce, and there was no decision there or question there about where they should work. It was a more general question about should they be allowed into Australia. I think that reflects an underlying concern within the Australian population about the state of our economy, particularly the state of our skills base within the country, and how we have perhaps neglected our skills base in the past and missed some opportunities. And there is a realisation there that given how our economy is developing and where it is developing, particularly in the northwest of the country, where there are problems attracting Australian labour there for a variety of reasons, the lack of mobility among the Australian workforce is a traditional barrier within Australia, and then we have lack of recognition of skills across state boundaries, which is also a big issue of concern. I think the respondents in this poll have sort of tapped into that and realised that we do have skill shortages, we do have significant skills needs, and where possible we should top up. And this was shown in Roy Hill with the need to do that. We have 6,000, a workforce of at least 6,000 Australians there, and maybe up to 1,700 from elsewhere, maybe less. But I think that was very interesting in demonstrating that the public as a whole recognise that we do need to do more as a country to build up our skills base, whether it is to import labour or to develop it indigenously.
Meg, can I move on to that question about criteria on which we allow people to come and migrate to Australia? I noticed that we noticed that there was quite low figures for religion and race, but quite a high figure for values. What do you think Australians mean when they talk about compatibility with Australian values these days?
I found that figure quite interesting, and I was interested to know whether there was a difference across age groups around that, because I think that the high ranking there for values really is embodying some of the things around religion that people may not wish to actually tick the box for religion, but would actually bundle it as an attribute that people are looking for, people who are a lot like us or prepared to be a lot like us and to think like us, and that's what they're really meaning by values, and that's why you've got such a steep drop-off at the end. But I also think that it's reflecting perhaps a difference between what younger people might be thinking about versus an older generation that really does think about things in those much more stark descriptors.
The next question would be that I would ask is, how would you define Australian values?
Well, exactly. that was kind of left open.
Yeah.
But I think it means different things across the country. It very much
does. Yeah. I mean, Rowan, I'm going to bring you in on the generation thing there, because when we cut the figures according to age cohorts, we found that 3 times as many of the over 60s that we asked thought that race was an important factor as those between 18 and 29, and twice the number of the over 60s thought that religion was important compared with the cohort 18 to 29. How would you interpret those differences in age opinions?
Well, people who are older have grown up in a white bread Australia, and there's no doubt that commitment to religious practice has fallen away quite severely. So I think that explains that quite clearly. Whereas today, our kids are in schools with people from all over the world, and that's normal. I think people have come to feel like that. And in fact, overall with this question, I think it's interesting that people talk about populist politicians seeking to tap into anti-migrant sentiments. Yet in recent history anyway, you can go back further, of course, Pauline Hanson era, you'd have to say overall her career not seen as a total success, even not really a big success on dancing shows on TV. So, I'm not really sure that this is something that people can tap into. And I don't know, if you'd taken the survey since Roy Hill controversy, maybe there'd be a different result. But I think maybe not. So on Q&A last night, people might have heard Barnaby Joyce and Christine Mill tapping into this theme of anti-migrant theme, underlying it, anti-Chinese, of course, harking back 100 years to federation. I think that's going to come to grief in today's Australia for the reasons we talked about.
I think that boat will hit the rocks because, as this is shown here, there's very strong support for skilled migration, and that is the key point here. People recognise the skills, and it is by number one, with a bullet, the factor that people believe that we should be bringing workers into Australia to benefit the economy more generally, and that's why the government in the last budget did increase the skilled migration level to 190,000, and that was welcome because industry needs it. And I think the population has recognised that.
And I think there is very much a difference in that debate between ownership of assets versus people, and that's certainly comes out in those figures. But I think it also came out in that debate that you were referring to on the television last night, because I think that there is a general sense that there is an economic opportunity at this moment for the economy, and it's quite important that we seize that and not let it drift by. And if that means bringing in a more skilled labour for specialised things, that's a good thing, because it is allowing us to do the thing that people acknowledge again through the poll was the thing that saved us from the last crisis, or that's what they believe. Therefore, they don't want to actually do anything which is vital.
And the same applies to business migrants, I think. I wrote a piece that was in our paper yesterday about this, and I was particularly impressed by a fellow I interviewed who lives in East Melbourne, who come here with his family. He's a logistics guy who started out in a factory earning almost nothing and knew about factories, how to get ship stuff out. But now, and they came on holiday here, they loved Australia, they moved there with their 2 girls, and he's now starting to fill containers going back that were going back empty because he knows the Chinese market. So he said to me he's gone to more Rotary Club meetings than anyone else he believes in Melbourne this year, because he's trying to extend his networks, Guanxi, and meet people with that sort of aim. I suspect most people would applaud that type of endeavour and that type of migrant.
Particularly because of all of the meat pies and chips you'd have to eat at those Rotary functions.
I think coming through here is a sense, though, that I found is that a concern among those polled that we don't want to squander this boom again. And that comes through in 2 ways. One is through the skilled migration and migration more generally. And secondly, almost paradoxically, is this concern about foreign ownership of land or companies and concern about that. But I think it's sort of heading in the same direction, but almost in a slightly confused way.
Okay.
That we don't want to waste this boom again. We've wasted them before. And you would think that people are thinking we should bring in skilled migration and migrants to value add to our commodities, to our resources, to our energy sector, to our farmland and agriculture, to our manufacturing sector. And that's where I think they're thinking that we need that skilled workforce.
Well, I mean, let's go into the figures on investment in farmland. I mean, were you as surprised at that figure as I was? I had no idea it would be so high. When we wrote the question, I thought, maybe 60% or so.
I was very concerned because I checked some data and only 11% of Australian arable land is owned by foreign entities. And it's not a big number. It has almost doubled from about 5% in 1984. So over almost 30 years, it's doubled. But it's still not huge growth, and there are limits around. What I think the concern is coming through on that is that people don't feel that it's a little bit out of control. There are no limits, and I point to the New Zealand, what they call the Shania Twain case there, where she wanted to buy up a whole lot of the South Island and was stopped because there was concern about what she would do with it. And then in the northwest recently, you had the case of the Western Australian government selling off 12 or 13 parcels of land, and the Chinese SOE coming in and saying, we'll just buy the lot. It doesn't matter what it costs, we'll just buy it. And those sort of things don't resonate with people, that perhaps there aren't the boundaries or rules around this that perhaps there might be. I think that may be coming through very strongly.
And now we've got the discussion of turning the Ord region into
Asia's food bowl.
Yeah.
I mean, it would seem to me that farmland is the asset that you can least pick up and take with you. But there does seem to be this very kind of visceral reaction. Is it just farmland, or is it, what?
It's not just Australia. New Zealand has an unbelievably low threshold. 5 hectares you have to get approval for a foreigner buying there. As is,
It's $50 million.
Money, it's a lot, and a lot more. But if I wanted to buy half a hectare in China, I couldn't. So I think it's not particularly Australian. There's quite a common sense. But we've been here before. The Vesti family have bought huge amounts of Australia in the past and sold it when their business crumbled and so on. So we're going through another wave at the moment.
And it's a factor coming back to, I think, what Ines was saying is this the best use of our resources? Which is the thing that the factor of Chinese control over large parts of what people would call our best farmland, is that going to lead to the best and most advantageous use of those resources for Australian interests, which I think is underpinning a lot of that. But I also think what is coming through and adding to the height of interest is the whole coal seam gas debate, which is what is a competing use of farmland.
Which could ruin the farmland. Yeah.
Or the water resources underneath.
Yeah.
That sort of sense of the natural wealth of Australia, as well as that there are some competing land use areas for coal mining in Queensland, the Darling Downs, and really, again, it's that same thing underpinning. And so I think it comes back to this question, we are very wealthy, it's judicious use and a planned use of those resources in our national interest, and not feeling, as Emma says, that it's somehow being run out of control and that, hello, who's home, who's in charge. And I think that's really what people are looking for.
It's not helped when in Beijing the Chinese authorities count land that they've acquired overseas as sovereign Chinese land.
Do they really?
Yeah.
So I think we've been here with whole sectors before. When we went through, starting really from Jeff Kenneth in Victoria, the sale of utilities.
Yep.
There was a lot of questions raised about foreigners, and I remember what's his name, the former Premier of South Australia, when he was the opposition leader, when Li Ka-shing, the Hong Kong billionaire, richest man in Asia, was asked, was buying, is it gas or electricity? Electricity. He said, in Parliament, he said, we'll have the reg guards controlling whether we can turn a light on or not, So,
good stuff, yeah. Look, very quickly, climate change. Meg, as a former ambassador for climate change, do the figures surprise you?
No, in fact, it's very much what you'd expect given the history that we've been through. And I think those longitudinal numbers are interesting. I was just drawing some lines down on what were the gaps in support. And in fact, the high point was, in fact, the 2007 election. And the biggest drop in support actually took place between that and the 2010 election, which does help describe for you why it was such a big debate in the 2010 election. These sorts of numbers are in fact echoed elsewhere in the world, most notably in the United States, but also elsewhere. A little more dramatic for us. I don't think it's been as dramatic elsewhere, where we've actually had prime ministers and opposition leaders fall and lose leadership on the basis primarily of this issue, among others. And so I think there's a big job for the whole narrative to change, because as the Nielsen poll that's out today shows that there's still quite a lot of confusion in people's minds about what is the best approach forward. There really isn't a vote of confidence in either party's approach to what is the best way of dealing with this issue. But I think the biggest thing that's going to be interesting is the degree to which it shifts away from climate change per se into energy pricing and energy security and the nature of supply of energy. That is going to be the coming issue, and I think that's underpinning a lot of this lack of certainty, because people are starting to see costs rising for other reasons in addition to this, and it's all adding into a feeling that this is another area which is not really being controlled in the way that is in best interest.
Rowan, that high number for supporting a future coalition government repealing the tax, does that give Tony Abbott heart and support, or would there be a bit of a sting in the tail there, a bit of a dilemma for him?
Oh, I don't think he's conflicted on this.
Okay.
I don't think there's I don't think he's been with all due respect, waiting for a polling on this particular issue. I think he feels viscerally that this is an issue he's going to chase down every way he can until the election. So I think that's his sense, and repealing is a real problem, isn't it? Because of everything else that the government's added added to it all the sweeteners. Do you repeal sweeteners as well as repealing the bitter pill? That's really very difficult. And I think that, as you're saying, the problem partly is everything's loaded into this issue. The huge amounts of money being spent on transmission lines between states and so on, which is all coming out we're all paying much higher electricity bills, and people have got a ready-made target that they're blaming, even though we haven't got carbon tax in yet.
This is a very black and white question. Are you in favour or opposed? I'd suggest if there was are you uncertain, there'd be sort of 99% out there, because nobody quite knows what we're going to have beyond July 1, except there's been a lot of huge amount of debate here within Australia, probably per capita, more debate, more newsprint used on this issue than any other place in the world. So it's just created this atmosphere of uncertainty in the public, but also amongst business as well. Not knowing what's coming next, how you can pass through costs, how you'll be impacted at home, how you'll be impacted in your business, how your supply chain will be impacted. So all that's still to work through. And I think as the debate, probably the high point was leading up to Copenhagen, and probably after that is when it went off the cliff, where the debate really ran off the rails within Australia, and they're sort of trying to put it back on the rails. So within the business community, there is still enormous uncertainty about how this will play out.
And I think, coming back to LOWY's real reason to exist, I think the Copenhagen failure really highlighted the failure of Australia and countries with which it worked closely to understand how politics works in China and how people think about decision-making, deal making. A remarkably inept display, and expectations forcibly built and then dashed.
Disappointment, I think, plays a big part in this too. Expectations.
I think we can expect that's going to be an ongoing role for everybody in this debate, because there isn't going to be another international agreement of the type that people have been continually holding out the hope for and ramping up the rhetoric for every annual session that it happens. And for precisely that reason, unless we can find some other way of really managing China and India's entry into this international framework, it's just not going to happen. And therefore, you're always going to have this mismatch between the domestic settings and expectations and actually that international reality.
I think it's also coming through. People have realised that nobody else is going to replicate what we're doing here.
No.
I mean, there are versions for sure, but at lower price or different systems that nobody is exactly replicating. And you're getting that sense now that we are way out ahead in front of the pack, for better or worse, but that's where we are, and that is what is driving views of it.
Particularly as Europe and America are in deep financial trouble.
It's not going to get better. No.
Look, very quickly, before we open it up to audience discussion, democracy. Rowan, you wrote about some of the democracy figures this morning.
Astounding.
What I would call a blasé attitude among Australians towards democracy. Why is that the case?
Well, there's a few potential reasons you can hazard. It's your first year to ask the question, so it's going to be really one of those interesting ones. I hope you're going to enable us to benchmark in coming years. The various things, as you said to me when we discussed it yesterday, there's the possibility that people are very depressed by the apparent behaviour of our politicians, whether they go on from there to blame democracy as a whole and say, well, there are other systems that are better. Maybe if we had a dictator, we wouldn't have such bad behaviour. But then dictators are not known for their wonderful behaviour, Idi Amin wasn't, he was a dictator, but you wouldn't really want him to run the show. No. Yeah. So I think there are other things that might underlie this. Particularly interesting is the high figure for young people 18 to 29. Only 39% believe that democracy is, what was the question again?
A better form of government than
any
other.
Yeah, so only 39% in Australia. So we've seen a real refusal to preference democracy amongst young Australians. One of the reasons might be, also apart from those other ones, a lack of civics education that's in schools. I think there's been a withdrawal from the field of people learning about that. I think also there's been, with the rise of new media, a narrowing of people's awareness of the world, oddly enough, to mainly focus on English-speaking celebrities in London and America. So I think people are, oddly enough, less aware of what's happening in other places than they used to be. And I think another factor is the question of the way in which in schools and in universities relativism has made big inroads, in which people are actually told that preferencing one value over another is wrong, that the truth is unattainable, and we shouldn't do that. So if the Chinese system of government, our system of government, they must be equated. They must be regarded as equally valid or invalid. And I think this is a real problem, a real defeat for us. And I don't know where we can get out of it, but it's a wake-up call, I think.
There are all sorts of democracies, though. So, I mean, no two democracies are the same. So you have to weigh that up. And perhaps particularly with that younger age group, they're looking at what's happening here now. We have a minority government. So I took that as being a sort of, among the young, there's a pox on both your parties or both your houses type view. This system isn't working. It's not producing the outcomes we want.
Yeah.
They have very young, in particular, traditionally much stronger supporters of the Greens, for instance. Perhaps there's a feeling that the Greens don't have enough influence on government or outcomes. That's highly debatable in my view. But I think that sort of comes through, that maybe it's that sense of disenchantment with what's going on in Australia at the moment, and our sort of a drift in our direction coming through among the young. My suggestion to you is next time you ask the question, for those who aren't happy with democracy, ask them what their alternative is.
Would be,
And
yeah.
that'd be,
Well, that's where I think it's interesting to see Indonesians are more wholeheartedly supportive of democracy, because they've
They have a
seen something
memory,
else.
yes.
And that is very encouraging, by the way, on the other side. I think it's a bit of a pity that we're less supportive of democracy than our neighbours, but it's great to see Indonesians so full-hearted.
Absolutely. And I have to say that Fijians, whom we also ask the same question to, have quite similar profiles in their attitudes to us. But Meg?
The only thing that I'd be interested in is the degree to which there's an age difference in this trend as well, whether what you're seeing very much is this Rowan's view of what the young are thinking versus the others who haven't actually had enough of experience of other
societies. Yeah. Okay, we're going to now open up the session to discussion and questions from the audience. We'll start with Richard.
Your program director for North Asia, Linda Jacobson, said at a Harvard luncheon yesterday, and she is really quite an expert on China, that the Chinese are fiercely competitive and argumentative about domestic policy and will criticise their government very much. But on foreign affairs, they all pull together behind it. And one of the things she said was that on Copenhagen, they think it's a plot. They thought it was a plot to inhibit China's capacity to expand. Now, question, is it Jeff over here?
Yeah.
Jeff, I'm surprised that you say that one of the inhibitions to getting workers over to the West, or up to Queensland, if you like, from the southern states, is a barrier of qualification recognition. I would have thought that the mining companies themselves did this. You know, a plumber, a mechanic, a painter, a plasterer, an electrician, a sparky. Wouldn't they do this themselves? And why hasn't this come out? It didn't come out in Q&A last night. It doesn't seem to be something that people recognise, that there is an easily solvable problem about legislation to recognise across the board tradies' qualifications.
Thanks, Richard. It's one of the big deregulation challenges that Australia faces. There are inhibitors for recognition of skills in trades, in those basic trades, electricians, plumbers, all those sort of basic skills. There are different qualification standards and both different qualification criteria and licensing recognition agents between each state. So the classic example is after the Queensland floods last year, they wouldn't allow South Australian electricians to come into Queensland to help repair because they didn't have Queensland recognised qualifications. And the fact that it was said by some of the bureaucrats in Queensland, those South Australians will kill us all. I think we all work off the same system nationally. But that is a problem. So you've got to get that, and that's a huge barrier to labour mobility within Australia at the moment. And it's been recognised by the federal government and the states, and they are now starting to act on it.
Not only in the skilled trades, but actually in the professions as well.
Yeah.
It's across the board.
Yeah.
Gentlemen,
Emmons, thanks very much for a terrific discussion. Sounds like there's a red light there for all of us with regard to democracy in this country. But just apart from the issues you've raised of migration, investment and climate change, what strike you, and maybe Michael as well, as the most significant red or green light for the conduct of foreign policy as far as the government's concerned?
well, I think if I can jump in first, is the continuing strengthening of public feeling about the US alliance. Now, my point is not an anti-US alliance point, but this sort of overwhelming public support, I think probably could take us into areas where we do things with the Americans uncritically without thinking through what our interests are. That was the area that did worry me. That given the kind of love fest with Obama, and I do think these figures are partly about President Obama. When we asked who Australians would prefer is elected in the United States in November, and it was a 9-to-1 split for Obama. So we are very much in love with him, and with the US alliance at the moment. I guess I would just urge, our leaders and our policymakers, yes, there is a lot of public support there. That's a good thing, but let's not lose our heads over this.
I would say that what I took out of this was very much the bifurcated view on China that we have. We have concern about Chinese investment into Australia, and that flows through in a couple of different survey questions. But then at the same time, the question on how did we get out of the last global downturn, it was hugely because of China. They came to our rescue. So on the one hand, we like you buying our stuff, but we don't want you to have it or get close to it. And that is a very sort of interesting phenomena that we have going on within Australia. I think, and that's as we're having to shift a little bit to get used to having more Chinese investment in Australia, bigger Chinese interest in Australia, and then how do we handle it? And I think that is a really interesting conundrum for governments going forward on this tension between, and also these issues around China and security. So you've got the commercial Chinese interest on the one hand and the security Chinese interest on the other, and they seem to be pulling apart even more. And that's going to be a big conundrum going forward.
I would say it's sort of this intrusion of the whole question of China and its influence into the domestic economy and quite deeply into the domestic economy. And in terms of a challenge for foreign policy, I think it's actually a broader government and in particular, but also business challenge for how to put this into a coherent narrative so that it doesn't present this constant dilemma for people, because people clearly do see their prosperity very much linked with China, but don't have a clear narrative around how to manage that and how it is being managed. And when you look for any of that direction from government anywhere, it's very, very patchy and often very hot and cold in response to particular issues rather than setting it in a big picture, which the US alliance always consistently has been, with the exception of a few episodes of history, that really has helped build that into people's thinking around the merging of the economic and the security, and we don't have that with relation to China. It's a big yawning gap.
I think people are rightly discriminating between their feelings about Chinese people as individuals and Chinese business people, workers, and the Chinese government, the party that is a very jealous party that runs China, controls every institution in the country in a way that we don't see in any country in the world except for North Korea, really. And I think people are inhibited in they're conditional in their views about China, and that's why people often raise these questions about state-owned enterprises. What do they mean? And of course, state-owned enterprises are the big 120 are run by people who are politicians as well as business people. They move between, say, being a party secretary of province and running a big SOE and so on. So I think that makes everything conditional. I think creates a bit of a limit to the closeness at that intergovernmental level, while at the same time people, as we get to know Chinese people more again, feel reasonably warm. And we haven't talked about feelings towards other countries, this part of it, but China's in the top half of the countries that you ask. Yep. I mean, I'm happy about that. I love China and Chinese people, so there we go. And so it's in the 59 degrees of warmth. Number one, New Zealand, 85 degrees, way out ahead. But the US and Japan are next, 71 and 70. But China's sort of up there. But I think there is this sort of ambivalence, and that's understandable. As we get more engaged, as you say, the economy matters. Their economy matters heaps to our economy. We're mattering more to each other. That doesn't necessarily mean that we agree more, that we get closer, particularly at that governmental level, but hopefully understanding, yes.
And we've seen the new tourism campaign for China, so we'll have much more in terms of migration coming through. We have the governor of Guangdong province down here today. Those visits are increasing, so the interaction is only going to be increasing. There's no other way about it at that people-to-people level, and that'll be interesting to see how the poll shifts over the next decade.
Absolutely. John.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for a very interesting discussion. I was interested that one of your key cohorts is 18 to 29, and it occurs to me that next year is the 30th anniversary of the ending of the White Australia policy. And that's the biggest, most far-reaching reform that's happened in this country, probably just about ever. And it was achieved on a basis of bipartisanship, which these days you would think seems to be almost unachievable. So the fact that there are still 10% of people who are prepared explicitly to put race down as an important factor actually surprises me in a negative way. But I just wanted to ask you, in the light of that, the fact that great changes can occur, there's another significant change, but of a much less sweeping kind that the country's waiting for, namely the question of our head of state. And seeing Howard O.M. on television the last few days leads me to think, why don't you have a question on that in future polls? Because one of the arguments for ducking the issue is, well, it's not a hot button issue. It's not uppermost in people's minds. It'd be interesting to see actually how uppermost it is in the minds of the kind of people who've been polled.
Wouldn't be polite, John, in the middle of the Diamond Jubilee. I did ask Michael, there was a quite semi-serious question. I was asking where the polling was done, because that 10% figure really did intrigue me. I mean, where that sort of figure came from. And I think it's reflected much more in the older cohort than the younger. I think it goes back to Rowan's point about people at schools and universities being much more exposed to people of different races and cultures now And my prediction would be that figure will just drop right off over the years ahead. You're a function of your upbringing and your culture in many ways.
Well, just one other comment that I'd say is that if you look at the numbers for democracy, and I think really thinking about the level of understanding that people have around our system of government, that's probably another reason why who your head of state is doesn't matter very much. It's more a question of where the popularity of royal weddings and diamond jubilees, rather than any fundamental thinking among most of the population, and particularly younger people, about what actually is the role of a head of state. I just don't think it would be part of their general comprehension as something that actually matters very much.
I agree.
Just down the front here, second line.
Hi, Alex Carrodus. Did the poll give any indication of where Australians stood should China and America come into conflict?
We didn't ask that question directly. What we do ask is a question around whether people think that Australia and China could come into a situation of a standoff within the next 20 years. We have been asking that over time, and we found that there was a 6% drop in that figure from last year. So it's still a reasonably high number. I'll have to quickly check unless any of my co-panelists have memorised it. It's still a reasonably high number, but there was a 6%, which is outside of the margin of error drop in that number. The reason why is an interesting one that I'll throw to my co-panelists while I look for the number. But it does show a moderation, I think, of concern about China in a security sense.
Though it's interesting, I suppose, it tangentially related to it to see that if China objects to having more than inviting more than 2,500 Marines to rotate through Darwin, then the number of people who will be in favour increases.
That's a proxy.
And so I think in a way that illustrates it. And we actually haven't heard a formal opposition to the rotation of Marines. I mean, if you look on the map, of course, in net terms, those Marines will be much further from China than they are now if they come to Darwin, for example, a lot further away. So, but I think it illustrates something that people sense about populations everywhere, that if you push people you challenge them, they will respond in this sort of a manner. And sensible Chinese and Indonesian diplomats will be reading this and learning from it if they hadn't already.
Just those figures, Alex. The question is, do you think it likely or unlikely that China will become a military threat to Australia in the next 20 years? We started taking that number, that poll, in 2009. So 2009, 41% said yes. 2010, 46% said yes. 2011, 44% said yes. And this year, 40%. So we've seen a bit of a rise and then a fall, but always much stronger numbers, 57, 52, 55, 58, saying no. So it's quite an ambivalent attitude around that particular question. But we have noticed over time a steady growth in the support for the US alliance. So from a low point in 2007, a steady growth in support for the US alliance. Okay, one last question, Mark.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Martin Welsh from the New Zealand Consulate General. I guess we can only be heartened by the New Zealand figure in there. It's good to be Mr. 85%, and as we approach the 100th anniversary of Anzac, one would hope that figure might even creep upwards. Who knows? One question: I'm just wondering whether the methodology that you employed allowed you to draw any to extrapolate the differences in views between states. Do New South Welshmen feel differently about some of the issues as opposed to Queenslanders? And my final I guess, contribution would be an observation, although we haven't really touched on the Australia-New Zealand survey, but again, I see it as positive in terms of trans-Tasman economic integration, that the figures of the latest survey suggesting that economic integration has not gone far enough have increased from 31 to 42%, and as we are perched on the 30th anniversary of CER, again, I would see that as a positive thing. There's some headroom there. Thank you.
Just in response, Martin, we can cut the figures that way. We haven't for this particular poll, but for those who are interested, all of our poll results are on our website, and you can go in and you can play around with them and cut them any way you like.
I thought I was interested. There's another dichotomy here that the economic integration hasn't gone far enough, and that's always a question on a whole range of areas. But we're less enamoured with the idea of a single currency now than we were previously. So there's this sort of dichotomy. We don't like that Anzac idea anymore. So I think you could interpret that any way you want, and that might go to the relative strength, perceptions of relative strength of our economies, or however way you want to cut it. But I thought that was because there was very strong support for that single currency there for a while, particularly when Tim Fisher was running around in the late 90s promulgating this idea, but that's gone now.
We'll get
you eventually.
Anyone watching the Euro crisis would say monetary integration.
And there was when there were when the coalition was in power here in Labor in New Zealand, there was some sort of provisional agreement working towards a common domestic boundary, as you'd know, and that seems to have disappeared from the radar as well. I'm not sure why, because if that had happened before 9/11, you would have said that's reason, but it was since that it was started, and a lot of people in business and in tourism thought that a good idea, but that just seems to have been dropped. I'm for it myself.
I think the fact that we like New Zealanders the most probably reflects that LOWY interviewed about half of New Zealanders living in Sydney.
Could have been something to do with it. We support free migration for rugby players. So, look, I'm afraid there are other questions out there. I do apologise. We have run out of time. Please have a close read through our polling. Not only this year, but past years. We're very interested in feedback and what people's reactions are. We're also very interested in suggestions for questions in subsequent polls. Can you please join me in thanking our three panellists?
This year's LOWY Institute poll was conducted in February and March. It was conducted among 1,100 Australians across all Australian states and territories, across all age groups from 18 years up, and equal numbers of men and women. The poll was conducted by both mobile phone and landline phone. It took about 20 minutes. We've worked very, very hard on the methodology of our polling over time, and we estimate that the margin for error in any of these figures is around about 2 to 3%. What I'm going to do now is just take you through some of the headline results, some of which were featured in the introductory video. This is what we found in this year's LOWY Institute poll. On migration, of course, amidst the controversy over the Roy Hill mine, we of course asked this question before that controversy came out, and we found that, of course, 62% of people were in favour of temporary migration to fill labour shortages. What's interesting for me about this poll is that this particular result is that 25% are strongly in favour of temporary migration, 26% are strongly against, which seems to show some bifurcation in views. We asked further questions about migration. This is the first year we've asked these questions. We asked people what criteria they thought were important for the government Australian diplomat. She was Australia's Ambassador for the Environment and Deputy Chief of Mission for Australia in Washington, DC. Our third panellist is Innes Willocks. He is the Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group. Innes joined the AI Group as Director International and Government Relations in 2008. Prior to joining AI Group, he held a number of senior roles in both the public and private sectors, including serving as Australian Consul General to Los Angeles, Chief of Staff to the Foreign Affairs Minister and Manager of Global Public Affairs for Singapore Airlines, based in Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our three panellists.
Well, welcome to the LOWY Institute. Thanks for coming along. I might just start with some migration figures. Innes, you've been looking at this issue quite closely. Were you surprised by that level of support for temporary skilled migration?
In a little way I was. It was surprising coming with the debate we've just had, and you were very prescient in asking that question. But I think what underlined that response with, I think, 62% in favour of the importation or the use of skilled migrants to work in our workforce, and there was no decision there or question there about where they should work. It was a more general question about should they be allowed into Australia. I think that reflects an underlying concern within the Australian population about the state of our economy, particularly the state of our skills base within the country, and how we have perhaps neglected our skills base in the past and missed some opportunities. And there is a realisation there that given how our
deciding who comes to settle in Australia, and we got as the most important criteria quite a strong result for work skills, English language skills, having similar values to Australians and education, and quite a heavy drop-off when we came to religion and race. Climate change and the carbon tax. Of course, legislation since our last poll has been passed, legislating a $23 per tonne price for carbon that will be instituted from the 1st of July this year. We asked Australians whether they supported or opposed that, and you can see the results are 63% are against that particular piece of legislation, 45% strongly against. Climate change, of course, is one of the questions we've been tracking over time. We've been tracking it since 2006, and we've seen a remarkable change. We've seen from 2/3 of Australians who supported aggressive action against climate change in 2006, that fall to just over 1/3 this year. We've also seen a remarkable rise from 24 to 45% of people who think that climate change is a problem, but it's not a pressing problem, and that we should act progressively against it and not incur too much cost. We also asked a new question about whether what people credited with Australia's avoidance of recession during the global financial crisis. We gave them two options. One was demand for Australian resources from countries like China. The other was because of good Australian government policies. And as you can see, 70% to 41% agreed with the first option. Perhaps one of the most surprising results was, again, when we asked for the first time whether they supported foreign investment in Australian agricultural land, and a very strong 81% against, including 63% strongly against. Chinese investment, keeping in mind 70% of Australians thought that our relationship with China had kept us out of recession during the global financial crisis. We see that there is still significant opposition. 56% this year thought the Australian government is allowing in too much Chinese investment. And we asked, well, among those who object to it, why do you object to Chinese investment? You probably can't read that, my apologies for that, but the two highest were China is seeking to buy Australian mining and agricultural companies, and these need to be kept in Australian hands. and China has so much money to invest it could end up buying and controlling a lot of Australian companies. Again, between last year's poll and this year's poll, the government has announced that 2,500 US Marines will be rotated through the military base in Darwin. We asked whether people are in favour or opposed, and we found strongly that people are in favour. We also asked whether people supported more US Marines, more US soldiers being based in Australia, and we found, again, quite a strong result in favour. And finally, we asked whether people would still be in favour if China or Indonesia objected to that, and we actually found that the figures increased if China or Indonesia objected to it. That's a very brief summary of some of the results that we have come up with. Sorry, there's a couple more here. War in Afghanistan continues to grow more unpopular. A decade on from the Bali bombings, I would say an ambivalence about whether the bombers have been brought to justice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite the members of our panel who will be discussing with me our poll today. Our first panellist is Rowan Callick. Rowan, of course, is the Australian's Asia-Pacific editor and was the newspaper's Beijing-based China correspondent for 3 years until returning to Melbourne at the start of 2009. Previously, he worked for the Australian Financial Review and was a senior writer with Time magazine. He has won the Graham Perkin Award for Journalist of the Year in 1995 and 2 Walkley Awards for Asia-Pacific coverage in 1997 and 2007. Our second panellist today is Meg McDonald. Meg was appointed the CEO of Low Carbon Australia, formerly the Australian Carbon Trust, in February 2010. Prior to this, she was president of Alcoa Foundation and a director, Global Issues, of Alcoa Inc. in New York. Before joining Alcoa, she was a senior